Hello everybody, my name is Gary Wills. Welcome to episode 27 of my channel. Those of you who've watched episode 25 will know that I used that episode to look at the Battle of Crysler's Farm from 1813, but using the Valour and Fortitude rules, at least version 1.5 of those. Today's video looks at the same battle but refights the scenario using Black Powder 2nd edition.
This map shows the enormous extent of the territory that the campaign or the war of 1812 to 14 actually took place in. But the scenario today takes place in a small part of that entire theatre of action on the border between the United States and British North America or Canada. So the bit we're interested in is one of the invasions of Canada that the US launched during this war. Major General James Wilkinson, after some delay, had left Sackett's Harbour and was moving up the St. Lawrence River towards Montreal, which he hoped to capture. In pursuit, the British and Canadian forces were led by Lieutenant Colonel Joseph Morrison of the 89th Foot, who led a small corps to observation in pursuit up the river. So just beyond Morrisburg, on the banks of the St. Lawrence, the two sides came to blows at a place near Crysler's Farm. So let's look at the battlefield in a bit more detail. The first thing to note is, compared to today, as a lot of you will know, the St. Lawrence was much narrower waterway then than it is now. The map I used for my refight is this one by Lieutenant Colonel Joseph Bouchette from 1815. I've used it because Bouchette was a lieutenant colonel in the Lower Canada Militia and was also a surveyor of Canada. So I assumed he knew what he was talking about, given it was done so quickly after the battle. An alternative map is this one that's in Lossing's field book of the war, and I chose not to use it, although it is the one that forms the basis of the maps in Donald Graves's excellent Field of Glory about the battle. What it shows, however, better than the previous map, is that the Americans were actually closer to Montreal than the British were, and decided that they needed to get rid of the British before they could continue their advance. And you can see the American flotilla and their gunboats moored to the east here, with British gunboats from Morrison's force to the west. This chart shows my version of the battlefield and the opening deployment, which I've tried to make as close to the historical deployment as possible. And the key thing to note here is the reinforcements, which I'll talk about later on. You also see some pretty pictures of the key players.
This slide shows the scales and the unit sizes that I use with the scenario. My game is on a 6x4, 6 foot by 4 foot board. I use a figure scale of one figure is 33 men. For Black Powder, my unit sizes are a standard 6 to 8 figures, small 4 to 5, and large 10 to 12. So this reflects the small size of the units involved in the battle. And the ground scale is 1mm to 2 paces.
So this slide shows the layout of the terrain as I modelled it on my 6x4 foot battlefield, and I'll go through the key features of the terrain. The woods at the top of the photograph are treated as rough ground which blocks line of sight, so they reduce their speed to half speed. The fences that cross the terrain are all considered as normal linear obstacles with half a move to cross, as are the streams on the bottom of the photograph. The advice I got from various sources was that the fields were often wet in places, and so I've used the ploughed field markers here to represent areas where again the going was reducing speed to half speed. In the woods, the visibility was reduced to 12 centimetres in my centimetre scale, and obviously the St Lawrence is only passable to the boats. Hopefully those of you who know the battle will have guessed that the Americans start the game on the right hand side of the battlefield indicated here, and conversely the British start on the right hand side of the battlefield and with their forward posts towards the centre. So now I want to cover the deployment in a bit more detail, starting with the British on the left and Morrison's brigade. So the infantry of Morrison's brigade are provided by the 2nd Battalion 89th Foot and the 49th Foot. And this close-up enables you to see the war bases acrylic tokens that I use to mark attributes that the regiments have that are used only once. So the tokens are taken away once the first fire has taken place and the first brake test has happened. This close-up shows you Morrison himself behind the infantry, and also the section of 2 6-pounders from the Royal Artillery. Finally, on this particular side of the battlefield, I did paint up a couple of figures to represent the Dundas militia, although they really played no part in the battle or this game. And lastly, on this left flank, the 2 gunboats on the river are represented as shown here in this photograph. And here's a close-up of the gunboats, which are a bit of a problem to represent on the table as single models, because relative to the ground scale they would take up a lot of room. So I've downsized them from the photograph on the right to a Peter Big rowing boat, and doesn't do a bad approximation, but it is still very much an approximation. Here in the centre of the battlefield by the river is Pearson's brigade. And in a bit more detail here you can see from left to right there's 1 6-pounder supporting the brigade from the Royal Artillery. Then there's a composite unit for black powder purposes made up of the flank companies of the 49th Foot and the Canadian Fencibles. You can see Pearson himself from the 23rd Foot in close attendance. And a bit further back is the remaining companies of the 2nd 89th Foot. And finally, for the British skulking about in the woods at the north of the battlefield were Heriot's light troops. And these comprised a standard unit on the left here of Canadian voltigeurs, supported on the right in the 3rd base by a tiny unit of First Nation troops, and there's the provincial dragoons are represented to make up the complete organisation. I think there are only 12 of them on the day. So let's now turn our attention to the Americans. So we'll start on the American left with, in black powder terms, Walbach's brigade. He didn't really have a brigade, he was an adjutant, and but he did organise the light cavalry and the artillery as it came on the battlefield. So given that the American commander had a lot of ground to cover, it was easier in black powder terms to put him in charge of the cavalry and artillery as a brigade commander. And you can see him in close up here with the unit of light dragoons in support. So next we have Leonard Covington's brigade in the left centre of the American line, and these comprise the 25th US Infantry, and they're accompanied by a yellow marker denoting the fact that they're wavering. They have the wavering special rule, which means that each time they get a casualty they need to take a break test. And as you can see, several of the units on the American side have been given this based on Graves's account, or the personal accounts in Graves's book, about the American reaction to coming under fire from the British. In the centre of Covington's brigade is the 16th Infantry, with on the right the 9th Infantry. So finally, in front of the brigade, different to valour and fortitude, is a small group of pickets or light infantry drawn from each of the battalions. Next up is Cole's brigade on the centre right, and although it's not very clear in this photograph, Cole's is actually on foot. Which was true for some of the American commanders. I've represented it here in the form of Colonel Isaac Coles of the 12th Infantry. So Cole's brigade comprised his own 12th Infantry and the 13th Infantry. And again, as for Covington's brigade, Cole's brigade is led by the pickets or light infantry from the two battalions. Finally, on the right, we have Brigadier General Swarthout's brigade, and this brigade comprised the 1st 11th Infantry and a very small unit of the 14th Infantry, and the large unit that was the 21st US Infantry. And as before, the brigade is led by a small unit of pickets or light infantry. And finally, and by no means least, the Commander-in-Chief himself, Brigadier General John Parker Boyd. So in this scenario, as in the real battle, the Americans receive some reinforcements. So they will go first, and move 1 is about 13:30 in the afternoon. On move 8, the first of the US artillery models arrive, followed by on move 10 the other two models. At about 4 o'clock, which would be move 11, the boat guard started to arrive on the battlefield just before sunset on move 14 and dusk, which would bring an end to the whole thing on move 16. So both sides have the same victory conditions. They need to break 2 of the enemy brigades. So you remember the British have 3 brigades and the Americans 4 before the end of turn 16. So this photograph, which you'll see every turn, shows the position from the American point of view at the end of their first turn. So Covington got a good brigade order, and his columns of march advanced quickly across the first set of fences and started to cross the stream that barred their progress. So in the centre, Cole's brigade also made very good progress across the first line of fences, again in march column, and it's probably worth saying at this point that in these games I've not allowed either the British or the Americans to use attack column under the black powder rule, so they have the choice of advancing either in line or in march column. However, Swato's brigade was a lot slower in making progress through the woods on turn 1. So we're now moving on to the end of British turn 1, and it didn't start very well. Mulcaster's gunboats failed in their command test and clearly caught a crab and were unable to move down the river. So Morrison as brigade weren't terribly successful in their command test, but they did get one move which enabled them all to form into column of march and limbered guns ready to advance next move. On the other hand, Pearson's brigade quite happy to wait the oncoming Americans in their rather strong position behind the stream and fences. And so it was the case with Heriot's light troops, who were happy to await the oncoming Americans from their chosen positions. Right, so let's now move the action on to the end of American turn 2. We'll start on the right with Swato's brigade, and here you can see them attempting to advance through the woods. Their pickets got forward within close range of the light infantry of Heriot's brigade. And on the centre right, Cole's brigade continued their advance across the ploughed field towards the third row of fences. Covington's brigade struggled in their attempts to cross the stream and made little progress. Although Covington's pickets managed to advance to the row of fences in front of Pearson's position. On the left of the American position, the light dragoons moved forward in support of Covington's advance. So let's move on now to the end of the British turn 2. And the first thing that didn't happen was that the gunboats stayed in their original positions, having caught a crab again or anchored while they ready themselves for action. Meanwhile, Morrison's brigade began their advance across the fields, crossing the first rail fence, heading for the second in support of Pearson's brigade. As far as Pearson's brigade was concerned, they were obviously holding their position, but the companies of the 2nd 89th Foot at towards the top of the photograph advanced forward to the broken down fence line in support of the rest of the brigade. On the British left, Heriot's light troops stayed where they were, but their fire caused a casualty on Swato's pickets, shaking them. And now we move quickly on to the end of American turn 3. So looking at Covington's brigade, we can see immediately the pickets advanced further, crossing the last rail fence to engage the Royal Artillery, and they caused a casualty and disorder, shaking the artillerymen. Meanwhile, Covington's infantry had deployed into line and advanced further towards Pearson's position. In support of Covington's brigade, Walbach brought the light dragoons forward towards the British line, keeping them in cover for now. On the centre right, Cole's brigade were forming up along the third rail fence with their pickets advancing into the next field. On the right, Swato's columns advanced in support of their pickets, closing in on Heriot's light troops. Now we move on to the situation at the end of British Turn 3. And starting with Heriot's light troops on the British left, they held their position but were unable to score any more casualties on their opponents. Meanwhile, Morrison's brigade were continuing their steady advance towards a position in which they could challenge the oncoming Americans. On Pearson's brigade, they'd continued the advance of the 2nd 89th Companies, who crossed the ruined fence and closed in towards Covington's men, forming a line with their other colleagues. The other development is that the artillery, ignoring the fire of the skirmishers, had managed to disorder the 25th Infantry. The gunboats, however, continued their run of bad luck, in this case having a blunder, and that meant they moved slightly forward but more towards the flank, almost off the table, but they were too pretty to take off the table. And now we move on to the end of American Turn 4. And if we look at Covington's brigade here, they've managed to continue their advance, although the disordered 25th Infantry had to stay where they were. And the light infantry continued their peppering of the British artillery. Meanwhile, the American light dragoons kept themselves out of the way. Unfortunately, on this turn, Cole's brigade could make no further progress towards the British. And similarly, Swato's brigade were restricted to forming line to prepare for an advance on Heriot's troops. Moving on to British Turn 4, during the shooting phase, a casualty was caused on the 25th US Infantry, and this required them to have a brake test because they had the wavering special rule. And they duly throw a snake eyes result on the brake test, which meant they were broken and removed from play. So looking at the picture at the end of British Turn 4, there's a bit of a hole in the American line. And looking in more detail at Pearson's brigade, the 2nd 89th have advanced forward to close in on the advancing American infantry. In the centre, Morrison's brigade continued their advance across the fields towards the Americans. And the Royal Artillery managed to find a convenient hillock on which to unlimber their guns. And Heriot's light troops held their ground, awaiting the onslaught of Swato's brigade. And the gunboats continued their bad run of form, catching a crab yet again and staying stationary. Moving on to American Turn 5, the excitement was provided by Walbach, who led the light dragoons in a follow me order to charge the companies of the 2nd 89th, who promptly formed square. And having their job done, the cavalry withdrew to a safe distance. So the 16th US Infantry were now able to charge in on the square of the 89th. This photograph shows the overview situation at the end of American Turn 5. So the close combat between the 16th US Infantry and the square of the 89th went the Americans' way, but the square is obviously a very tough nut to crack and held them off. In the centre, Cole's pickets were able to advance towards the next row of fences, but the rest of the brigade was left in cover. And on the right flank, Swato's line infantry marched forward through their pickets and engaged Heriot's light troops, disordering them. We're now moving on to look at the situation at the end of British Term 5. And you can see here that Heriot's light troops have held their ground and started to inflict damage on their American opposite numbers, causing disorder as denoted by the red tokens. In the British centre, Morrison's brigades have reached the central fence and formed line behind it. So the action in front of Pearson's brigade is pretty fierce, as a lot of musket fire, artillery fire cause disorder on the Americans to their front, and the ongoing close combat involving the square was again inconclusive, as the square managed to survive the break test. Better late than never, the gunboats managed to advance to be in a position to more closely support Pearson's brigade. So now in American turn 6, and in the centre, Cole's brigade charged across the field to make contact with the 89th foot behind the fence, and they got disordered due to closing fire, but as close combat ensued. Likewise, the ongoing close combat for Covington's brigade against the square of the 89th continued. And although the square lost very badly on this occasion, they were still able to hold their line because they didn't break. So this is the overview at the end of American turn 6. And if we look at Swato's brigade in more detail, you can see here his infantry have caused more disorder amongst Heriot's light troops. Meanwhile, the close combat for Cole's brigade has been indecisive at this point. Although, as you can see here, both sides have got 2 casualties. So at the end of American turn 6, you can see Covington's brigade is still embroiled in the contest with the square of the companies of the 89th foot. For Walbach's brigade, the light dragoons, because they were disordered, were unable to withdraw out of the artillery fire. We're now looking at game turn 6 for the British, and you can see here that for Pearson's brigade, the second 89th square now well shaken, 2 excess casualties, but even so, their break test result was 10 and they survived. In the centre, the 89th of Morrison's brigade were successful in the close combat against the 12th US infantry. And with the excess casualty and the disorder, the 12th US infantry were forced to retire by their break test. You can see here also that the other infantry of the brigade, the 13th US infantry, have been shaken and are disordered. So this photograph shows the position overview at the end of British turn 6. And you can see here that the gunboats have finally got themselves in a position to cause the American left wing some real trouble. And you can see here the square continues to survive in Pearson's brigade, despite receiving a lot of hits in their close combat. And you can see here Morrison's brigade holding the line of the rail fronts, while the Isaac's brigade are disordered before them. So Heriot, meanwhile, under the fire of the Americans, has chosen to take a disorderly retreat as his move. falling back, but keeping in line with Morrison's brigade. Moving on to American Turn 7, we need to look at Covington's brigade in a little bit more detail. In the ongoing close combat with the square, 5 hits were recorded to none, and the square looked to be in reasonable amount of trouble. Those 5 hits converted into 2 extra casualties, excess casualties, and finally the square was broken. And if we look at the other battalion in the brigade, they charged into the Canadian fencibles, becoming disordered on their way in and receiving casualties. In the close combat that followed, they did, however, inflict 3 hits on the fencibles at the cost of only 1 on themselves. This resulted in 2 casualties on the fencibles, who lost the close combat, but were able to hold their line because of their steady characteristic. So this is the overview at the end of American Turn 7. So looking at the Covington's brigade at the end of the turn, the 16th Infantry have used their follow-up move after their successful close combat to move into support of their compatriots. In the centre, Cole's brigade is now broken because both units are shaken, as you can see here, using the dead horse markers, which in my games denote shaken. Meanwhile, on the right, Swartwood's brigade has advanced into close range of Heriot's light troops. And we're now moving on to British Turn 7, and obviously the main game in town here is the continuing close combat between the 2 sets of infantry involving the Canadian fencibles. This ended in a draw, but importantly both sides are now shaken. And this brings us to the end of British Turn 7, which you can see the overview here. Heriot's light troops held their ground, trying to stop the Americans with their fire. In the centre, Morrison's brigade was happy to see Cole's brigade disappear off into the distance. And this shows the overall position for Pearson's brigade at the end of British Turn 7. And as you can see with this picture, there are a lot of dead horses there, showing that everything's pretty much shaken. So the start of American Turn 8 is the time when we evaluate the situation in the game, and as you'll have imagined from the previous slides, 2 of the American brigades are now broken, Covington's brigade and Cole's brigade, and that is a big problem. On the British side, obviously Pearson's brigade is also broken. Overall, this means the game's ended up in a British victory. So it's time for a few brief conclusions. I guess the first thing to say is the game gave a historical result with a British victory, and the special rules they set up meant that the American army reacted pretty similarly to how it did on the day. And unfortunately, in this particular version of the scenario, the American artillery didn't manage to get on the table, which is ahistorical. It makes me wonder whether the Americans on the day would have been better off waiting for their artillery before they advanced with their infantry. But nonetheless, the speed of the end and perhaps some rather rash American charges hastened their demise. I have to say I always try to play with the rules as written for these games, and occasionally you get some things that concern you, and obviously the square of the 89th was incredibly durable, against the 16th US Infantry. I'm not sure about that. The right result happened in the end. It just took too long. The square was never going to win the combat, but with a lucky set of break test results, they managed to last a lot longer than maybe they should. So I don't know about that. Any ideas or suggestions will be welcome. Anyway, that's the end of this video. Thank you very much for watching. A few close-ups of some of the figures. All of the figures on the table were miniature figurines, and they're quite nice, and I enjoyed painting them. So thank you very much for watching, and if you like what you've seen, please remember to like and subscribe. Thank you very much.